again to our podcast, Disrupting the Dominoes, that is Disrupting the Dominoes of Violence. I am Arlene Lemus. I'm the CEO of Pay Prevention, Proactive Anti-Violence Education. And when we say disrupting the dominoes, we're speaking of the full spectrum, microaggression to full physical event. And we're very excited. We're having so much fun with this podcast. And today we have a really cool guest, just a really interesting pathway to violence prevention work and all the work that he has done. Finding his way to make change within the YWCA, finding his way to make change within the military branches, Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, having an impact on what was happening at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and how they're approaching violence prevention for athletes. Just a really kind of cool and interesting pathway of doing great work in the violence prevention community. So with all that said, I'm really excited to introduce our guest, Eric Barreras. How are you, Mr. Eric? Welcome.
I'm doing wonderful, and thank you for that amazing introduction. And also, thank you for getting my name right. Like, I think you're the first person ever to get it right out of the gates.
Oh, well, I actually was like, you know what? I wonder if Eric, has accepted the Barreras approach, or if he wants the Barreras approach. But as a half Mexican and half Polish person, I hear a lot of Limas in my last name many, many times. So it's important that we try to get our names right? That's something that's truly only ours. So yeah. So one thing I didn't mention in that introduction, Eric, and that we're going to talk about more, I'm sure, is also the founder of Difference Makers, 10 Strong. So I'm excited to hear about that. But before we get to that, how are you doing? How are things going? Where are you at right now? And how did you get on this path to violence prevention?
So I'm doing great. First and foremost, I'm doing great. Obviously, there's so much in the world to contend with in terms of where we're at right now. But from a professional standpoint, I'm happy with where I'm at. I've always tried to stay in the vein of, as you mentioned, violence prevention. I got into this work initially as a detective, working obviously the response to acts of violence with a very specific focus of sexual assault, child abuse, and domestic violence. But I think it actually goes a little deeper than that in terms of, why. I get a lot of questions over the years is why would you want to do that kind of work? Even in terms of advocacy. And I think it really comes from a place of, I'm a child sexual abuse survivor, and I grew up in a domestic violence home. And I think that's the root really of why I want to do what I do in this movement.
Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing. I guess I should, it's not that I feel an apology is needed, but I will say I'm sorry that that's the path that led you here, but I'm so grateful that you are here, that the path has led you here. So thank you for that. So can you tell me a little bit more about your work with the military and its efforts to curb violence prevention? You mentioned that you came in kind of as a detective, and I think that was through the military. So can you share that information a little bit?
Absolutely. So I got wind of the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command, really because they came to our unit to do an investigation. It wasn't anything related to what I do, what I specialized in, but that's where I first got wind of them. And when I learned about what they did, I was drawn to it immediately. How they carried themselves, doing something that I actually wanted to be a part of. I was a firefighter at that time, and I actually wanted to be a military policeman coming in the Army. So when I learned of CID, I was like, that's what I kind of want to do. Like, I want to learn more about that. So I inquired about it, and the rest is really history. I spent about 14 years in that space as a detective until retirement.
And did you get your start in the New Mexico National Guard? Is that where is that what I read?
Gosh, yeah, my bio is so confusing. I even get confused sometimes. So yes, I actually started in New Mexico National Guard for about a year. Then I decided I wanted to go active duty. I enjoyed military service so much that I didn't want to just do it on the weekends and during the summers, which is what most reservists and National Guard members do. When I went active duty is when I actually switched gears, because they didn't have the job that I was doing active duty wise. They didn't have that. So I had to read what they call reclass, and I became a firefighter. Again, with that initial vein of wanting to be a military policeman. We don't have that. We have firefighter. Would you be interested in that? And I was like, wow, that's kind of close. I mean, we could do that for the interim, right? And so I enjoyed it, but it wasn't keeping my cup full. It wasn't what I originally wanted to do. And so again, when I found out about CID, I was able to make that transition, and that's where I stayed for the rest of my career in the military.
Okay. Okay. So would you categorize or characterize your work in the military as more responsive or reactive, or did you find a way to get involved in a prevention on the prevention platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the first probably 80% of my career was really kind of in this response mode. I'm responding to acts of violence, and we're running thorough investigations to really kind of unpack everything that has to be packed in those types of situations, right? Towards the latter part of my career, I actually started working more collaboratively with Army SHARP and SAPR programs. Keep in mind, in the very beginning of my career, SHARP and SAPR programs did not exist, right? There was a component of advocacy, but it wasn't quite what it transformed into in the military, which is the SHARP and SAPR programs. For those that don't know about SHARP and SAPR, it's basically victim advocacy programs within the structure of the military. And so I started towards the latter part of my career, I started working more collaboratively with them on, let's just say, community awareness events where we would go in and talk about certain acts of violence. I was obviously going in from the lens of a detective and what it does to individuals from that perspective in sharing. And I really developed a deep appreciation for advocates and SARCs. And I thought to myself, man, I wish I would have learned about this, or I wish this existed a long time ago when I was in, because I would probably have been a SARC or a victim advocate instead of doing investigations. So that kind of led into post-retirement, transitioning into victim advocacy as a civilian for the military and doing that work.
Right. Okay, great. So, I mean, it's really been a nice organic path for you, finding your way to advocacy and the difference that you're making now. Really cool. So do you want to just share, I know that in the sporting world and in the military world, acronyms are very easy for us, but could you share what those acronyms stand for our listeners and our viewers?
Absolutely. So when I said SARC earlier, it's a sexual assault response coordinator. It's more of a program level type position. They also can serve as an advocate, but they're mainly more focused on setting up the programs and policies within a unit, having that leadership engagement, and really kind of managing the response and recovery process of victims. Whereas a victim advocate, their sole focus really is no different than what a victim advocate would look like in the civilian world, which would be providing resources and support for an individual. And so what other acronym, am I missing another acronym here?
You said two. It was like SHARP and something else.
Yes. So SHARP is sexual harassment sexual harassment and assault response program. It's essentially for the Army. Okay. And then whenever we say SAPR, it's sexual assault prevention and response. It's really the same program, but each military branch has given it a different title. And the biggest difference is that the Army includes sexual harassment into the vein of their work, whereas the Air Force and Coast Guard and some of the other branches, it's not to say that harassment is not an area of concern for them, but they don't have it rolled into that overall initiative. That they deal with sexual harassment in an entirely different vein. And so the Army has actually included all of it, which I think is a really great idea, because there's a lot of intersection that deals with harassment and obviously assault. So, but yeah, that's the SHARP and SAPR.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So When I read about some of the work that you've done and that you're doing, I was incredibly impressed, and I want to hear more about this 75-hour course that you were able to design while you were working with the YWCA. Could you please share some information on that? I'd love to hear it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I do want to say here is that I certainly did not design it. I don't want to take credit for that. It was a course that was already in existence well before I got there. The YWBCA is just an amazing organization that really focuses on grassroots violence and social injustice throughout our communities. They're actually a global organization, right? So my involvement with that program while I was there was really kind of looking at the overall structure of the course in of itself in terms of when we were going to unpack what subject. I thought it was really important for us to try and kind of somewhat build it in such a way that we need to understand this before we go into that, if that makes sense. The way the course was structured prior to that, because of the amount of speakers that we had involved with it, which really included a good 40, 50 different speakers throughout this entire course, which is something that was also very unique, at least from all the other worlds I had come from, where maybe it was 10 or less speakers to unpack that level of certification. This involved a lot. And so with that being said, the schedule had to be massaged in such a way sometimes that you just got to kind of fit people where you can fit them. And so I tried to be very intentional with still trying to remain focused on working with the external speakers, but really relaying the importance of trying to at least to narrow it down a certain place on the schedule, because I felt really, I felt coming from a place of, again, we need to understand this before we unpack that. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about the program? It was a 75-hour course. From what I read. Who was this course made available to? And if you could share some of the topics that were involved in this course.
Oh, absolutely. So it was a 75-hour course essentially intended for community victim advocates operating in the Bay Area. Okay. And this would have been a focus area on sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking, with layers of social injustice and dynamics of racial considerations that we need to make when we do this work, right? Because there's a lot of intersection with that as well. Now, the course in of itself is actually, it's credentialed through the California OES, which is essentially the governor's office of emergency standards, Office of Emergency Standards, Cal OES. And so it's actually credentialed through there. So we'll get our content, we'll get it shifted. We'll funnel it through the credentialing body to get approved, and then we'll be able to train advocates. And it's the same model that the entire state of California uses to train all of its advocates throughout their community. So it's a state certification, essentially.
Very cool. Very cool. I think having, access to someone for 75 hours and imparting a skill set is just an awesome opportunity.
Oh, it was amazing. And I think one of the biggest challenges was, because 75 hours is a lot. Most training courses are about on average of 30 to 40 hours. They do that kind of work, right? 75 hours, and we're not doing it in person. So it actually had to be spread out virtually. That's proved to be a real big challenge. But we tried to keep it at about 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, really giving ample breaks, things of that nature. But it did essentially mean that it would be 75 hours over the course of about 3 months. When you really break it down that way.
Okay, great. It sounds fantastic. So tell me about what you are doing. What is the difference makers? What does that mean? What is that? Tell me about this.
Oh, I love it. And I almost compare it, not that we're the same, right? Because we're not, we certainly have different things, right? But when I heard disrupting the dominoes, I'm like, oh, wow, that really seems like something that difference makers is really all about. But from the difference makers standpoint, I really just wanted to create something that wasn't not because I believe policies and I believe laws and I believe leadership is so incredibly important in the movement. But what I believe is just as important, if not more, right, is actual individuals on the ground in the trenches. Like the work that they are doing actually should be in alignment with what a lot of leaders say needs to be done. And maybe I'm speaking from the perspective of military, and maybe if you don't have a military background, maybe you don't understand what I mean. But I feel like I wanted to really kind of focus in on bystander intervention and in the why. So bystander intervention, and then also just understanding the why, unpacking other topics. But why is this important? Why do we need to be focused on this? There's a lot of different motivations for individuals when they decide to pay attention to these issues. And we're not all coming from the same place. Not everyone is going to have my background, therefore they may not necessarily, well, I don't mean professional background, I just mean my background with victimization. Maybe they don't have that, right? And so maybe they're not going to be as focused on why we need this change, but we do need to find ways in which we can still find how it's connected to them and to everyone else, because there are ways, right? But really specializing in creating safe spaces as well in terms of how we unpack these conversations. And I'm going to give you an example. So if I'm talking to, I think those that understand the military know that the dynamics of it are essentially, when we're talking about what the military is comprised of, it's probably about 85-90% men and males, okay? It's a male-dominated profession and organization. And with that being said, there's a lot of hypermasculinity. And so when you're unpacking some of these topics, if we're coming from the vein of bad, what are you doing? How can you do, like, I'm just saying a lot of tactics and approaches really involve what men are doing wrong. And it's not to say that we don't need to have that conversation. It's not to say that we don't need to identify those things, but there's a way in which it needs to be done if you want them to not necessarily tune you out.
Right.
The important thing is that we're actually creating change. And I think really just kind of how it's unpacked is important just so much as the messenger is important, right? So I really wanted to focus in on not only just being a male, not to say that difference makers is all men, because it's not, right? It's about 14 different collaborative partners all coming from different spaces, but really contributing to these conversations in such a way that we're inclusive with everyone in the room, or at least we try to do our best to meet people where they're at. And I really feel that that's where change is really going to be made.
Yeah, I mean, part of our movement that has led to, the start of PAVE, the kickoff of PAVE prevention, had been deeply based in gender-based violence, and had been doing a lot of work, with women, predominantly women instructors for women. And when I entered into this, I agreed to attend this incubator that kind of kicked off about 7 years ago, this process that ended up with PAVE and a couple other businesses and organizations within our collaborative. My approach had come from years and years of coaching and, empowering people through sport and martial arts. And I couldn't fathom not having boys and men in my classes. It just didn't compute for me. So the idea that the movement had been so, in my opinion, limited, although I know that there is a need, for gender-based violence programming, I really feel we are not going to move forward as a movement if we don't have boys and men in our programming and at the table. So I completely understand your approach to creating the difference makers. So thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for mentioning that too. Like, I don't want to dismiss gender-based violence, because I believe it is 1000% real and it is there, and we need to have conversations about it. But I also believe in that same vein, if we don't unpack these topics in such a way where we're identifying that men and boys are also victims as well, then we leave out an entirely different kind of critical point that I really think needs to happen, a conversation about what that can look like. And I think a lot of individuals, even though I've been working with the military for a long time, in its conversations they've been having, at least male victimization, for the better part of at least 7 or 8 years now, they've been focused on really kind of weaving that in. It's a community that still struggles with it. So, and so imagine a community that doesn't talk about it at all, how they're struggling.
Yeah, no, there needs to be conversations, that's for sure. And I think even if we just are presenting program to create conversations, right? If the only thing we get out of it is now we're having a conversation about things, it has such a benefit. I have a peer and a good friend of mine in the DC area who runs a program called Safe Bars, where it's programming and training for bartenders and wait staff and restaurant staff to kind of identify certain things. And it's almost every training she has shared with me that they go through the programming, they start talking about these things and start talking about these little microaggressions that, start on the spectrum of violence. And it's an aha moment for some gentleman who is working at the facility who goes, oh, shoot, I'm that dude. I'm that dude that's constantly, making the poking remarks or cracking the inappropriate joke. So, I mean, that alone has so much value. People have heard me say it on this podcast before, a quote from Julie Harmon. We need to start normalizing mistakes and having conversations about intent. So if we can just start having that conversation like, oh, shoot, I am that guy, or oh, shoot, I am that person, it has the ability to have so much change.
Indeed. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I would even, Edward and I have, hopefully you'll get an opportunity to meet and introduce Edward to your community at some point, Edward Wilson, OB West. But we've had conversations with a lot of platforms where we've kind of unpacked some of the behaviors that you just identified, right? And somewhere in all of that, we try to do our best to remind others that it's not just men having those conversations, although I would submit that a vast majority of men have those conversations. But women also partake in some of those conversations as well, sometimes, right? And so I think it's just how it's viewed and how it's interpreted and how we understand it. And it's really just something that we need to kind of weave into that conversation.
Yeah, yeah. So my next question for you, how do you feel about violence in the military as far as it hindering preparedness? Do you have examples that you've seen this, or can you share what your ideas are about this? Because having taught martial arts and trained athletes in about 5 miles from Quantico, Virginia, I've had so many military families cross my paths. And we have had these conversations numerous times with parents of students and students themselves that, much like the parallel in the sporting community, where you see individuals on this really rocket trajectory to achieving some incredible things, and then they just become derailed because of something, some harassment or assault or even worse, right? And then we lose that athlete and we lose the potential that they had. I have shared stories with people that have shared in the military. It's something similar. And I can't imagine if someone is defending our country, I want the absolute best person in that position, the best individual, doing that job. And if we're losing high level people, and how do you view that impacting our preparedness?
Well, I think it directly impacts our preparedness on a wide variety of levels, right? Like, I think when we're looking at it from the perspective of someone who has been victimized, first and foremost, we're putting a lot of pressure on individuals who serve in the military. They very well may be 18, 19 years old. Maybe they're granted a security clearance, secret or top secret, and so they're given access to information at a very, very young age. Maybe they're responsible for millions of dollars of equipment at a very young age, right? Like, so again, I'm comparing levels of responsibility that we're really putting on individuals at a very young age, between 18 and 24, right? And factor that in with, we have to have 1000% trust to the person to our left and right when we're going into certain parts of the world. And so a big component of that is trust, right? And so something that is obviously lost when someone is victimized, particularly by someone who also serves or wears that same uniform, is an element of trust that can be broken down in such a way that can erode the relationship significantly, right? Like maybe they're not able to focus on whatever unique mission they've been given because they're dealing with trauma, right? And trauma shows up in so many different ways and impacts us in so many different ways. Maybe the other aspect of that too is that something that I've seen really some victims, because when I make references to victims and survivors, I don't want it to be all inclusive, right? Because everyone is different and how they're going to respond is different. However, when I look at one branch over another, and I'll use just as an example, the Coast Guard has a very small branch in comparison to the other branches. Therefore, their units are a lot smaller. And so that level of trust that we may put on someone, right? They're responsible for probably 10 different programs in that unit because there's only about 25, 30 different people potentially in that unit. And so now they have all of this responsibility. And if I go down, or if I need to take a knee, or if I need to get right, that just compounds the overall, like other people are going to have to now absorb what I need to rest and take a knee for. And this isn't just something that, obviously we need to be mindful of with sexual assault and harassment on a wide variety of other issues too that involve mental health, right? And so I always love to see when communities are having more and more conversations about this, but it absolutely impacts what they're doing because it's important. And I love how you bring in the parallels with sport, because even though it's an entirely different mission, right? Sports in protecting the country, but there are parallels. There is blood, sweat, and tears that is put into what someone is trying to accomplish in sport. And the bottom line is there's a certain level of trust. I would think, I've never been an Olympian, but I would think just based on my work in that space, there's a whole bunch of trust that's really almost family-like, right? Trust that's really put into really accomplishing that goal, especially if you're an Olympian. Because very seldom do they just roll out of bed and they're an Olympian. There's oodles and oodles of hours and blood, sweat, and tears and training that are put into that, right? And so when we break down that trust, it can absolutely impact everyone else that's involved in whatever mission that may be. But more importantly, how that individual recovers. Because if they're not comfortable, if they don't have faith in the system, whatever it may be, then they're not working on themselves. And if they're not working on themselves, what is that going to do? Not only to just the organization itself, but what is it going to do to them?
Right. Exactly. This is why we feel so important. This is so important at PAVE that our programming is 3-tiered. It's trauma informed and it's 3-tiered, right? It's prevention. So we want to give the skill set to prevent a violent event from occurring. It's in real time skill set to react and, strike, move, situational awareness, those things. And then 3, it's also a skill set that helps you heal, to regain some of your footing, regain some of what your power is, and help you move forward, through things. So it's a very unique approach, and it addresses things like you just brought up, that in order to move past and redevelop that trust, you need those things, you need those elements.
I agree. And thanks for identifying that. I'm so glad to hear that those are components of what you're focusing on, because I think it's needed.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so this is I have a fun question at the end too, but right now this is a question I ask all our guests on Disrupting the Dominoes, and that is, if you could have the audience of one person to sit in front of, and that you feel that conversation would help move our movement forward, right? It would just be the right person to move the movement forward. Who would that person be and why?
Oh my goodness. So, okay, can you ask the question one more time? I want to make sure I understand it.
So
completely.
if you were given a meeting today with one person, you could sit in front of them and ask them to help us move the movement forward on violence prevention. Who would that person be? And why?
Gosh, there's so many individuals that come to mind. And I think of people that are like maybe no longer living with us. I think of people that are still currently here. I think of people that have motivated me over the years. And if you're gonna twist my arm and make me just pick one, right? An individual who I just think the absolute world of, and who's really been a mentor to me over the years from an educational and foundational standpoint of why I do what I do. His name is Russ Strand. And he is he's currently working at West Point. He works with cadets at West Point, managing their SHARP program. And we all know what SHARP is now because we unpacked it earlier, right? But he has a background very similar to mine in a lot of respects. Former special agent, right? Personal connections to violence, things of that nature. But the work that he's just done throughout the Department of Defense and even in civilian law enforcement realms is just nothing short of amazing. And when I found out that he was transitioning over into victim advocacy at West Point, I was like, oh my goodness, what a perfect fit. So he's one that not only have I gotten a lot of insight from over the years, but an individual that I would still continue to just learn from because he's just so incredibly amazing.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. So here's my fun question. Being having New Mexican roots, red or green? That's got to be the question. What is red or green? What's your choice there?
Oh my gosh, this has to be like the best question that I've ever received on something like this, because I am from New Mexico, right? So, okay. For me, it like depends on what I'm eating, right? So if I'm gonna have some enchiladas, I like red enchiladas. I can't help it. But if I'm gonna have tacos or other meal where chili can absolutely enhance it, it's gonna be green chili. And the only thing that I'll say too is that the best chili in the world, just in case you didn't know this, and everyone tune in on this because it's best chili in the world is in Hatch, New Mexico. They got the chili out there is just amazing. Doesn't grow anywhere else. I'm pretty sure it's the soil and just all the goodness in that region that really helps that chili grow. But it's just simply amazing. I've never found anything that quite compares. So,
hence the Hatch pepper, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm a green, but I would do some red on some enchiladas as well. But I'm a green chile. Well, Eric, this has been fantastic. Thank you for taking time and joining us on our podcast. I wish you continued success. Please let us know how PAVE can help you in your efforts with 10 Strong. We'd love to see that take off and be even more successful than it already is. To our viewers, to those of you watching and listening, thank you again for tuning in to our podcast, Disrupting the Dominoes. If you enjoyed what you were watching and listening to today, please subscribe. Please know that you can get a hold of Eric. He's on LinkedIn. His 10 Strong is, you can reach him on his webpage. So again, thanks for tuning in to Disrupting the Dominoes. That's the Disrupting the Dominoes of Violence.